Hey, chiropractors, welcome to Modern Chiropractic Mastery with your host, Dr. Kevin Christie, where we discuss the latest in marketing, business, and professional growth with some of the leading experts in the industry. Welcome to another episode of Modern Chiropractic Mastery. In this episode, I'm excited to bring you Crystal Misenheimer of Progressive Practice Sales. She's been on the show before, but today we discuss a unique topic that was brought up in our closed Facebook group, and that really is selecting a location for practice. Whether you're starting from scratch, you're buying, you're selling and relocating. We talk about all those things and many more trends in the industry as it pertains to buying, selling, and starting practices in different locations. There's some interesting things that have definitely changed or maybe sped up a little bit since the pandemic. But we really focus on location selection. Everything from, it might be, a particular area within a particular town, but it might be a different state or something like that, right? So there's a lot of different variables when picking a location, and we dive into that. And Crystal's been one of my main resources for this type of information, even to the point where she is going to be our guest presenter in our final weekend of our mastermind in Orlando, November. And the topic will be built to sell, which is really building your practice to be able to sell it sometime. It could be 20 years from now, but the benefit of building your practice to sell is that it will sell for more. And while you own it and aren't selling it, it'll be much more profitable, which is a benefit also. And so we're going to have her guest present, which we're excited about. And as I actually record this introduction, we just got back from weekend 2 of the 2023 Mastermind, which was in Tampa, Florida. And we had the Scheduling Institute come and guest present for us. And it was just a transformational weekend. We talked a ton about the front desk, a lot about team trainings and culture building. And then we just had such a lot of good sharing with the doctors, very excited about this group. And coming up soon in the next month or so, I'm going to be opening up. There's not going to be a lot of seats, that's for sure, because I think the vast majority of our 2023 members are going to come back for 2024. And I've already got 3 that are slated to be added to it. And we're not going to go above 25 members in our mastermind, because then it goes from mastermind to conference. And we don't want that, because the essence of our mastermind is a lot of learning, a lot of sharing, and also a lot of relationship building between members, and getting away from your office 4 times a year and being able to connect with your colleagues and forge relationships and confide in your struggles and your opportunities, and having that to bounce off of. And the growth from it's been pretty substantial. I mean, we had 100% return from 2022 to 2023. I kind of shared this past weekend with our members the plans for 2024. And just the conversations of members saying things like, "Oh, I can't wait to be in Jupiter, Florida in January." You can tell a vast majority of them coming back. So I'm not sure how many seats we will have available. I'll let folks know through the podcast, email, and Facebook group if there is. But on top of that, I am strongly considering a mountain slash Pacific time zone cohort as well. We are taking the East Central cohort out of Florida next year in 2024. We will be in Florida for one of them in January, since the weather's great. And that'll be in Jupiter, Florida with Brett Winchester as our lead on that. But then we're going to be in Nashville, Chicago, and Austin, Texas. But I am strongly considering, and I'm getting some good inquiries from our West Coast and Mountain Time Zone cohorts. And I'm kind of thinking of the San Diegos and Scottsdales and Denvers and maybe Jackson Hole for there. I'm not totally sold on doing it, but I'm definitely doing the planning. I would need at least 10 members for that to make it a go. And I'll be sharing that as we go along, and if we decide to do that. But if you are interested in a mountain slash Pacific, even if you don't live out there and maybe you're in the Central time zone, or even heck, the East, doesn't matter to me. Just email me, kevin@moderndeskjockey.com, that you are interested. You don't need to necessarily commit to anything right now, but I'm just trying to get some feelers out there on the interest level before I do any more due diligence. So All right, that's what I've got for you as far as mastermind stuff. And here is my interview with Crystal Misenheimer. All right, welcome to the show, Crystal. I really appreciate your time. It's not your first nor your last, and I know your husband Kevin was on as well, and you've always been a great resource for us. And I recently was in a Facebook group exchange on kind of practice location discussions, and you were the first person I thought to reach out to have this on the podcast. So welcome to the show.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back.
Yeah, and just tell us a little bit about, can't assume every listener has heard our previous episodes, but tell us about your, professional side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the co-founder and lead broker of Progressive Practice Sales. We are a brokerage that specializes in helping chiropractors to transition into and out of practices. We do a lot of work in the valuation space as well and help chiropractors with achieving funding for acquisitions, startups, expansions, et cetera. So have a lot of work in this space right now. It's a very active area in chiropractic.
Yeah, and so let's start out with that. We're gonna get into obviously talking about location, but before we do that, can you just give us kind of a state of the profession, what you're the trends you're seeing over the last few years?
Yeah, definitely. It's a really interesting time to do business at all. I think over the last few years, everyone has had some pretty crazy, cycles through busyness. And in the beginning of the pandemic, I think a lot of people went through a lot of slow times. But in the world of practice sales, it's probably the busiest that we've ever seen it, which a lot of people find to be interesting because there's some interesting challenges in the economic environment right now, but that has not slowed things down at all in the practice sales. We have more activity both from doctors looking to sell and doctors looking to buy. It's probably at one of the highest levels we've ever seen. And then on top of that, we have a really interesting dynamic in the investor marketplace, both from the localized investor looking to expand regionally, all the way up to really big name private equity groups that are looking to put a footprint into chiropractic, very similar to what a lot of people probably recognized in the dental space over the last decade or so, of seeing all of the individual dental offices being bought up and consolidated.
Yeah, that's an interesting trend for sure. And then I know there's also probably some big chiropractic groups. I was having actual dinner with someone that works with one of them. I won't mention, but they open up their own locations, but then they also acquire some, and they have a kind of a mixed portfolio of that. So that's a interesting thing. We could probably do a whole episode on that. But let's segue from you're seeing a lot of just traditional chiropractic practices being bought and sold by other chiropractors, and a lot of that is been over the last few years. And you said mentioned before we hit record, there's like a trend of a lot of people just moving, and it's not necessarily chiropractors retiring. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. We are seeing a really high number of what we call lifestyle sales. So that's
Mhm.
a doctor who has built a practice, and often they're really successful practices, and they just are not happy where they've settled down. We see a lot of doctors who have realized, now that they've settled down and had a family, that they really wish that they could go back home and be closer to their family or have the same kind of environment to raise their kids that they grew up in. Or they realize that, after all of the things that have happened over the last few years, that where they settled down, they don't necessarily agree with how, that area is run. So they decide that they want to move somewhere else. Or
Mhm.
even just, sort of a resettling of, what do I really want to do with my life? What do I want to spend my time looking at and doing? And it's not where I am now. So I want to move somewhere with mountains or an ocean, or just do the things I love, because life is short.
Yeah, I've got examples of all of those in our coaching clients that have gone through that over the last handful of years, and even one group that we worked with, they just got really phenomenal job opportunities that provided a whole more, just a lot more security, benefits, just opportunities, and so that was their their driving force too. So I've been seeing that, and so you're saying this is happening a lot more over the last few years than in previous years.
Yeah, I mean, it really is very interesting because, historically people would sell when it was time to retire. And a lot of those practices are wonderful opportunities. They're institutions in the communities. But, sometimes older equipment, older way of running the clinics. And now, we have a lot of clinics that come in, they've got very new, equipment, technology, marketing in place, things that you didn't just see all the time. It was more of
Mhm.
a rare opportunity. So it's an interesting time for someone who's looking to start a practice to take that into consideration, that people who are selling these clinics just because they want to go back to say maybe rural Kansas or somewhere where they grew up, they don't want to
Mhm.
live in a metropolitan area anymore. That's a great opportunity for a young doctor who isn't necessarily looking to settle down, to step into a really modern successful practice from the start.
Yeah, and that brings up a point too where I always preach, younger chiropractors that are opening up their own practices, and you're kind enough to come actually speak on this topic to our mastermind in November, which is exciting. But it's like you got to start building it to sell right out of the gates, right? And it doesn't mean you're going to sell it tomorrow, but it does a few things, and one of them being is it makes a much more profitable, better run practice while you own it. But then, yeah, you never know. You may have started that practice thinking that you're not going to sell it till you're 60, but now you're 40, and like you said, things change, and you want to change location. If you've built that thing to sell, it makes it a lot easier to sell it whenever.
Yes, 100%. And I think that we can all learn from what we see other people doing that are ahead of us in the game of life. And
Mhm.
we see a lot of doctors that are doing that. And so I think it's normal to kind of accept and prepare for the fact that what you're looking for in your 20s is not going to be what you're looking for probably in your 40s. And so having that mindset from the beginning, it sets you up in so many ways to really profit from the investment that you're putting into your first practice. And then the great thing is if you do that, if you have this first practice, you sell it, you go where fits you best for that phase of life. Well, that is often the time too that we see doctors really starting to evolve in their philosophy of patient care. Maybe they want to get more specialized, they want to really focus in on something new that they're excited about. They're kind of over what they've been doing over and over and over on
Mhm.
repeat for the last 20 years.
Yeah, and then it's almost akin to where, you buy your first home, your starter home, and you decide you want to move somewhere else, but you now have equity in that house. You sell that house, you use some of that equity on a down payment for a different house, different location, different state. It could be the same area, just maybe a bigger house. But if you do this right, again, when most people that open up a practice, they've kind of said, you know what, I'm going to be here for a while. But if you built this practice really nice, just like if you renovated the house, but you really, put a lot into this practice, it does give you the opportunity to then use the money that you make from that sale to buy another location in a place that you decide that you want to be in. And so it's not all for naught. Yeah, maybe it's not ideal. Obviously, if you really like where you're at and you build a practice and it's great and you have it for 40 years, probably on the long run make a little bit more money in that way, just inherently. But this gives you options, and so I really want chiropractors to start thinking about that. And that's something we talk a lot with our coaching clients is that look, you got to really do this thing right because you never know what's going to come out of the future there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, to build on the housing analogy, which I really like, and just like you can renovate your home in such a way that actually doesn't add any value or even detracts value, you can do the same with your practice. And we unfortunately do see that where people have poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into doing something and it has actually made their practice harder to sell. So I think that it's really important to be intentional and be thinking about, what as I'm building this starter practice, which I may want to move out of into a bigger practice, which you could buy a bigger practice and not have to reinvent the wheel again. What is going to be highly transferable? What's a location? What's a practice model? What's a technique? Who am I building this practice for in the future to take over so that if the time does come, you have the ability to have a fast and, easy sale process versus trying to find the one other person in the country that, does things exactly the way that you've, set it up.
Perfect. All right. So I think that that's a great kind of endpoint of, say, the first decision making process on picking a location is, really try your best to find a place you want to be long term. Obviously, things change, and you can have options if you do it right. So that's great. All right, Docs, here is a new opportunity for you from Darcy Sullivan of Propel. She is our SEO specialist in helping out many chiropractors with their search engine optimization and making sure Google is finding you and getting you new patients. It's amazing how many new patients chiropractors can get and are getting when they do the SEO right and a few other things. And Darcy is offering a free SEO workshop just for chiropractors, and you can sign up for that at bit.ly/propelmcm. That is bit.ly propelmcm, modern chiropractic marketing, right? And so check out that link, and we're going to have you go over 5 SEO secrets to owning the first page of Google without buying ads. And Darcy's going to give that free workshop, 1 hour, to really help grow your practice and start churning new patients from the ever mighty Google, which is still king in the online marketing. So check that out at bit.ly/propelmcm for the 1 hour free workshop. And give a little bit more of the context of why I wanted to have you on here was mentioned before. We were in that closed Facebook group talking about this topic of location. And, I think we started talking about a little bit about the joint, and obviously they pick very strict locations, and even the way the shopping center is, you're never going to find a joint that's in like a medical building. They've got their due diligence for sure on there. And then someone had mentioned Trader Joe's, and there's actually a podcast episode on, I think, Freakonomics, talking about Trader Joe's and their selection process. And we kind of joked around about, just open up your chiropractic practice next to a Trader Joe's, and you'll probably be fine. And I looked at all the Trader Joe's in South Florida. I was like, yep, those are all great places to open up a chiropractic practice for sure. And so that was kind of how we got to it. And then there's always some back and forth where people will say, it doesn't matter where you're at, people will find you. The internet has taken over, say, being on Main Street and that type of stuff. I don't fully agree with that. Again, a little more context. My practice happens to be located very well within Boca Raton, Florida. Boca Raton, Florida is a very good place to be in for a practice. It's affluent. Now, the cost of running a business can be high, which is something that chiropractors need to take into consideration. I got in early, and I purchased my office real estate, so I don't have to worry about my rent going up and stuff. But I am I'm on the second floor in the back of a medical condo, and so not necessarily perfectly ideal. We've obviously overcome that in many ways, but I'm sure if we were right on Main Street and had big, huge signage, that would help as well. But my little long preamble there, I want to take us to what are some of the other things when you talk to chiropractors about location that you're really looking at and trying to guide them on?
Yeah. So when we're working with buyers who are looking for a location, sometimes it's for a startup, but usually it's for a practice that's already in existence. And what we really always want to start with is what is the practice that you want to have, whether you're going to have that from the very beginning, or you're going to kind of turn what you're buying into that, because that really plays into it too. Who are you trying to treat? Because if you want to treat cash patients, for example, that's the model you want. That's a really important consideration as far as where you're located, because you could be on a street that has a lot of traffic, but if it's not a more affluent, demographic, then you're probably not going to be having the people pass you that you really want to have in your practice. If you want to do a pretty niche or specialized service, you probably want to be around, a younger population. You probably don't want to be in a place where, all the families have lived in the area for 20 years. That's probably not your primary market. You probably don't want to be super close to, maybe an area that has factories or really large employers if you're primarily wanting to do cash, because they all probably have good insurance that they want to use. On the flip side, if it's an insurance practice, great, you're going to be very convenient for them. So I think that's one of the first things, is figuring out who you want to take care of and what you want to do, and making sure that the areas that you're looking at are a good fit for that model. No matter, because I think what happens with doctors, especially doctors who are in the beginning of their career, is they get caught up with the look of it. Oh, this looks so good. People are going to be really impressed with this. I'm going to look successful, therefore I will be. And there's something to that for sure. But you've also got to think about who's going to want what you are doing and what's going to attract them. Because, if you're trying to do, say, family plans, they may be turned off by the high affluent aspects of some upscale locations, because they might think, oh gosh, well, we can't afford this. Yeah. So I think that's a really important thing that can get skipped over just in the excitement of, what would feel good to me to have as my practice.
Yeah. And I want to give a few examples of that, and I'll use my current area for that. One is we'll get a lot of chiropractors that want to do personal injury in Florida. Boca Raton is not a great area for personal injury, right, because it's affluent, and personal injury tends to do better in non-affluent areas. So that's one example that we talk about down here. Another one was, like, I built my practice in network with insurances, and there is a lot of corporations around me. And I used to have on-site locations in there. We get a lot of the employee referrals from there. And then when we went out of network, we don't really have, I mean, we definitely get corporate patients, but not in droves from these local corporations like we used to. They stopped referring to us and recommending once they found out we were out of network with their plan. Now, what's offset that, because we are cash and higher rates, is that there is a high level of affluency here. And so it can sustain it. And so when I talk to chiropractors about cash rates or high cash rates, it's like, okay, we got to know, what's the demographics in the area and that type of stuff. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that based on what you said, because it makes perfect sense, is to start with what your target audience is, right?
Yeah, definitely. And, a few other things that I think are really important as you kind of hone in. So you've got the people who you want to attract, and then, how are you going to attract them? So I think, we personally, when we're listing a clinic, we have a list of things, and we say, well, are you close to these things? Because that's going to give you a really strong location. And it's like, are you close to a Whole Foods or a Trader Joe's? Are you close to a Starbucks, a Walmart, Target? What is driving traffic to that area? So, there's schools, hospitals, all of those we find, being pretty positive for drive-by traffic. I would say that your point earlier about the internet, sort of eliminating the need to be on a high visibility area, I would also disagree with that. In the case of a larger practice, I think if you really have a specialty practice, especially if your specialty practice has long visits and doesn't have the need for a lot of new patients, you probably are fine with that. But most chiropractors, that's not their model. And I think that the visibility and the drive-by or the walk-by traffic are really, really important for that.
Yeah, it's almost really, it's not intellectually honest to argue against that when people do. There is something to be said about having a lot of visibility, having signage, having convenient location, being in a retail spot that's got a Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, or even a good grocery store. There's definitely positives to that. Obviously, a chiropractor can do fine with it, but you could be potentially losing money. And it's always interesting too, where they'll look at, let's just make up numbers, but the rent in that ideal location next to a Whole Foods is 4,000 a month. But if I go over to here, it's only 2,700 a month. I'm saving $1,300 a month. But then a new patient in their practice might be worth, $1,000, let's just say. And so you really need like one or two patients to make up that rent difference. And so sometimes there's just a little bit of lack of really looking at all the variables.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. And I think part of that is just a lack of having a lot of fundamental knowledge about, thinking about the business side of things. I think that's an unfortunate foundation for chiropractic. And I will say that when we're looking at valuing a practice, the profit is king in that. So it is really important to keep an eye on the profit. And we see some people who have astronomical rent,
Yeah.
or they've bought a building, and if they were going to sell the practice, it has astronomical rent to the point where, the buyer wouldn't even be able to get a bank loan.
Mhm.
So you do have to be careful as you're getting up into the higher numbers, but $1,000, more to be in a location that's prime, that's going to have people literally walking by your door. I mean, that's a no brainer in
Well,
most
yeah,
situations.
and that's what's funny that you mentioned that, because that's something that I see myself running into a problem down the road is I own my real estate, and it's I bought it in 2013, and it's basically tripled. Luckily, my mortgage is the same as what it was in 2013, which is obviously one of the benefits of buying. Like, I don't know if I could afford the rent if I was trying to like renew a or sign a lease here for rent. And so I could see a situation where like let's just fast forward 20 years and I'm in my early 60s and I decide to try to sell everything. There's a chance the rent for my suite could be 10 to $12,000 a month in the market. But like, what chiropractors can afford 10 or 12,000 a month in rent? So then you might find a situation where like your real estate's outpace the selling a practice. And I'm sure you see some situations where the chiropractors just close the practice but sell the real estate for so much, and that's what their obviously retirement was.
Yeah, we do see that, which is unfortunate. That feels really bad to the doctor who has spent, decades building this practice in this community. But certainly, when you're faced with a situation where the real estate has that much more value and there's a
Mhm.
ready and willing buyer for the real estate, that's something that you have to take into consideration. Another good fit buyer for a situation like that is a doctor who is expanding into multiple locations, because from a bank loan perspective, they can still qualify for a loan that will cover, the practice that doesn't make enough money to pay for the real estate. So
Mhm.
it's definitely a small marketplace of buyers who would be a good fit. But the most important thing for people in your situation is just don't let the practice go down.
Yeah.
The biggest mistake that we see is doctors, they don't need to make the money anymore, but they love practicing, and so they move back to practice part time.
Mhm.
And then they have this building that's worth $1 million and a practice that's worth 100,000,
Yeah.
and that's just a very challenging combination.
Are you seeing any of the investors that are buying chiropractic practices buying the practice and the real estate? Is that sometimes happening?
That's really more on a regional level. Again, that doctor who's been successful looking to invest in the area, they see the value of the real estate and, paying themselves. But as you get into the larger investors, they are laser focused on the profit of the business because they're just trying to conglomerate all of that together into a bigger profit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, all right. And what are some of the other things that you're seeing as far as, location strategies when opening up a practice? I'll kind of touch on because you kind of in passing talked about industrial areas. I've had that experience in the past where I was working with someone and they were looking to buying something, but we looked at the map. It's like it's pretty industrial there, and it was away from where the practice was. They ended up not doing that, which was good. But um, yeah, the industrial thing can be a problem, I'm assuming too, right?
Yes, I have seen some really successful personal injury clinics
Mhm.
in industrial areas, especially in Florida.
Yeah.
But that is a challenge when it comes time to sell, because if the buyer's not familiar with that, it's a very strange thing to walk into this practice, tucked in between the auto shops or whatnot.
Yeah. And
But yeah, it's probably it's an unconventional choice.
yeah, and just to touch on it again, for those out there that think that location doesn't necessarily matter and your, referrals and web presence is going to be so good to overcome it, that could be the case. But then if you do plan on selling, you might be hindered there. So that's another aspect to consider for those folks.
Well, and I would also say that every business needs to have a balanced new patient source
Mhm.
strategy. So you can't count entirely on, I remember, gosh, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or something, that people would build their entire business strategy on like Facebook. And then Facebook would change something and
Mhm.
they would be destroyed. And so it's the same thing. None of us know what's going to happen with the technology. It's going to continue to evolve and change. And
Mhm.
so to put all of your eggs in that basket that changes so quickly, I think is really dangerous. Of
Yeah.
course, it's always going to be a part of your mix. But if
Mhm.
you can also be in front of people as they're physically moving past you,
Mhm.
there it just becomes this repetitive thing that they know that it's there, and then when they need it, it's the first thing that they think of.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it needs to be more balanced than that.
Here's another tricky scenario. I'm sure you've seen this before, but in theory, it would make sense if you had the freedom to, I'm going to open up practice in whatever state I want. I'm not really married to a particular state or location. Some may think to choose one that has really good insurance reimbursement, which would make sense on the face of it. But as we know, that could probably change too. What are your thoughts on that? Have you had people do that? As like, um, I think North Carolina's got good reimbursement. I know that I got a few chiropractors I work with there, and obviously North Carolina is a kind of higher up the totem pole of desirable places to live too. But I could see someone saying, I'm going to open up in North Carolina because it's got great insurance reimbursement. Have you had scenarios like that?
Yeah, we've definitely had people that are being really strategic about things like insurance reimbursements. But it's true, like those change, and also the scope of practice changes kind of
Mhm.
frequently, especially with all the new things that chiropractors are getting involved in. And so I think that in some ways you're standing on kind of unstable ground if you
Yeah.
build your entire business model on that. It's not bad to take it into consideration, and if you are moving from state to state, it's something that you should definitely look into. um, Definitely, I would say check with the maybe either you could check with the board or the state association, but if you're doing anything unusual at all, I would actually talk to a healthcare attorney and
Mhm.
have them do an analysis on the scope of licensure, because people are amazed at the
Mhm.
differences between states.
Yeah, and that's a good point too. A little bit of investment on a healthcare attorney or even, your group or other experts. It's like so many times chiropractors just cut so many corners to save some money. And I get it. A lot are bootstrapping it pretty significantly more than even other professions. It's like if you're a veterinarian or a dentist, like you have to, going in, if you're opening your own practice, like it's going to cost a lot of money and you're getting a pretty big loan you're taking on and doing all that. Obviously, there's difference in revenues and that type of stuff, but you don't see veterinarians opening up practices inside of gyms like you do in chiropractors. It's like a low cost way of doing it. And we could even have that conversation as far as your thoughts on the differences of what you see in practices between chiropractors that are, standalone building. Let's say all things being equal of the actual location, but standalone building versus retail space versus medical building like mine versus, kind of a pod doc, which I was when I got started that way, but I always knew I had to get out of there. Some of the things you're seeing with that as far as revenue growth, sellability, that type of stuff?
You know, I would say that the most desirable for people just on the face value is probably standalone, because
Yeah.
you usually have pretty ample parking, easy access. You have a little bit more control over your space, followed probably by upper higher end retail, because
Yeah.
again, you've got the visibility there.
Mhm.
But aside from that, it really depends on the area, because certainly there are medical complexes that have a lot of traffic and they get great cross referrals from other practitioners. And then you have this whole other established new patient source that you wouldn't necessarily have if you were, Trader Joe's is not going to be sending you people. So I
Mhm.
think that there's certainly other aspects that you have to take into consideration. One thing that I would say to build on top of what you were just saying about doctors cutting corners is I did another interview a couple years ago, and they asked me to go back and do an analysis of the practices that we had sold, and what were some common characteristics of the most successful ones. And the thing that really stood out to me was the doctors who were the most successful had really relied on outside expertise. They had heavily invested in consulting and education and training and marketing. And, they knew that they were never going to become the expert in any of those areas. And so
Mhm.
they paid the expert. I mean, you've got to get good people. You can't just hire anybody. But if you can find the expert in that space, your investment in them is going to pay you back so many times over. It's going to be ridiculous how much you'll get out of it.
Yeah, I get a joke about that because I've definitely spend more than most, or I should say, invest more than most in things like experts, and different things of that nature. All runs the, whether it's coaching or it's, having someone do the design of the office renovation we just did. Like I just know my limitations, and so I'm willing to write those checks. But a funny story is when I moved into my house a few years ago, I met my neighbor that's directly behind me. We share the fence, and we were out there introducing ourselves, and he was asking me what I did. I was like, "Oh, I'm a chiropractor." He's like, "Oh, where's your office?" I told him, and he's like, "Oh, my office is there too." And I was like, "Oh, what do you do?" He's like, "I'm an attorney." And I was like, "Oh, my attorney's right over there." And he's like, "Oh yeah, I'm a partner at so and so." And I'm like, "Oh, so I've helped buy your house." Because he he's partners at the firm where my attorney's at, and I've spent so much money over the last 12 years. They're my contract attorneys. So like, I've sold out of a partnership. I've bought my real estate, office real estate. They were part of that. I mean, all the contracts I've had. I mean, it's just, I've spent thousands and thousands of dollars. So he started laughing. But um, yeah, it's just you gotta put experts around you. That's why I've always talked about having like a scaffolding around your business that helps you grow
Mm.
and build. And it's putting those experts around that really help for sure. One thing I wanted to go back to, I didn't want to miss this, was, there are other realities, right? Like you mentioned, standalone building having better accessibility and parking. A lot of stuff's going to be very specific to where you're at as well. Like, if you're in a big city, there's obviously zero chance you're going to have a standalone building. And the people that live there expect you to probably be on the eighth floor of a small, and you might only have 800 square feet in, New York City. And there's going to be no parking. They know that they're going to have to get there. Like, so some of the I guess accessibility and just what patients are going to expect will be location specific. I do believe that. And here in Boca Raton, you find really only two mostly. It's either medical building where chiropractors are at, or retail, other than like the gyms and that type of stuff. But those are kind of where it's at. There's not a lot of standalone. It would just outprice most chiropractors, right? So
Definitely.
that's something to consider. If you're in small town, you probably can get a nice standalone building. Heck, you might even be able to live in it, right? Some of them are dual zoned and stuff like that. So I just want to make sure I touched on that.
Yeah, very, very, very true. And I think that the patients, I mean, that it would be weird for them, to have parking in the middle of Manhattan and stuff. So all of that makes perfect
Mhm.
sense. However, what's interesting is when you go to sell it and people are coming in from outside areas to look at your practice, that may not be the norm that they're looking at. And so that can still impact you. And you're thinking, well, that's crazy. Everyone walks here. There, why would you need parking? And the people that are coming into the area just going, oh man, that's just, I don't envision our patients going up to the eighth floor. Well, but that's what you do here. So you will still have some of those things that you have to overcome. But you're right. From a patient perspective, they live there. It's going to be the norm for them. I
Mhm.
will say one other thing about it too that's very interesting to me. So every once in a while, we'll have a situation where a clinic sells and then it has to relocate as part of the transaction.
Mhm.
And, we'll have clinics that move, less than a mile away. And sometimes it'll be a real obstacle. And
Mhm.
it's because of something like, ease of access into the parking lot, or, access to parking. They didn't used to have to, so, they used to have a small lot and now they have to park on the street and they might have to walk 2 blocks. It's really amazing, how people get used to things. And then when
Mhm.
you take them away, they get very frustrated. So, yeah, parking is actually a pretty big thing that I think a lot of people look at when they're buying. That when you're first setting up your practice, I think you almost might wave it away as a detail that,
Mhm.
well, it's not ideal, but we'll make it work. And
Yeah.
of course, Manhattan aside,
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
it's definitely something to keep in mind. I would say it's probably one of the top, 5 things that you would want to look at when you're sourcing a location.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I just want to touch on the gym thing a little bit because I have a lot of experience in that. And I do think it can be a great start for some chiropractors in a lot of situations. And every gym is different. But my experience, which I saw firsthand, was 2007 to 2009. I was upstairs in kind of a dingy training facility. But the cool part was they had a lot of pro athletes there, which was what got my kind of reputation going, which was really cool. So it was worth that. But the difference from when we moved out of that gym, and I built a pretty good practice there, but it was definitely a certain type of patients, right? Like that don't mind going to a dingy training facility on the second floor. And but then we moved across the street into a really nice orthopedic office, and we were again just renting 2 rooms. We had 2 rooms in the gym, 2 rooms in the orthopedic office. Everything else really being equal, except for now we're in a really nice orthopedic office, and my practice like doubled in a year, right? Because now people would walk in like, oh, this is a nice office. Oh, and they're inside an orthopedic office, so they must be legitimate, right? Like if an orthopedic would have them in there, and it just was really, it really made the difference. And then when I opened up my practice up in Boca, I did the same thing. I opened up inside of an orthopedic office, saved for a few years, and then was able to buy my own. But I just tell that story because I do believe pretty strongly that the chiropractors that are in gyms, there's going to be a certain level of growth. The good thing is typically your expenses are going to be really low. So if you can hit that ceiling of growth, you should have some good profits like we did. And you need to, at some point, save those profits, leverage that into opening up your own office at some point. And so use it as a stepping stone. Don't be in there for, 6, 10, 15, 20 years, in my opinion. And there are some gym situations that would warrant that, but for the most part, generally speaking, it's not ideal. And then I think chiropractors that are need to start looking at orthopedic groups that are willing to rent, or even primary care doctors, other medical doctors that might be willing to rent a room or two out, I think would be a better option than the gym if you find that option. So I just wanted to go on that little soapbox for a minute.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, we certainly see clinics that have opened up in gyms and they have a pretty low ceiling as far as the growth potential that they seem to have in there. And I think it's a lot of the things that you just said. I've also noticed that a lot of clinics that are in gyms, they seem to have less control than what you would normally have.
Mhm,
And I don't know if it's just, because so many gyms have big corporate ownership,
mhm,
but they seem to be a lot more restricted. And then another really important thing to know from a long-term value perspective is that when you own a clinic that is within another practice, that does present sale challenges
yeah,
in many cases. It really limits who would be interested in buying it, and it also limits the ability to get financing for it in some cases. We sometimes see people who rent rooms from other chiropractors, and
mhm,
that's one of the hardest things of all to sell. So just be careful if you're doing that to do keep it as a stepping stone, because what you
mhm,
might find out is when you get to the end of that road, you may not have anything that you've built a value over the years. Um, even to the point where, the doctor who's in there has, control over who they would allow to take over your practice. And
mhm.
otherwise they might just kind of absorb your practice.
Yeah. Yeah. It is
Yeah,
common, so a few things that you're going to run into in those scenarios, like you said, is the sellability is just not going to be there. So you don't have an asset. So you don't have an asset that you built. The other thing is I've, coach a lot of chiropractors, and the ones that I see that have, revenues in the 40s, 50, 60, 70 thousands a month, they're always in their own space, like it's not, you don't see those revenue numbers renting a room or two in a gym or even another chiropractor's office typically. And so, yeah, you might be saving on overhead, but it's all about profits, right?
absolutely.
And that's the big difference. I think sometimes chiropractors get stuck looking at that overhead number and not the profit number. And sometimes they get stuck looking at the revenue number, right? Like, oh, look at this revenue. It's 60,000 a month and they're losing money, right? So
Yeah.
so you go both ways for sure. But I just wanted to kind of finish on that. I think this was great. This was we covered a lot of ground. If anybody has any questions on this, obviously you guys do a whole lot. You do buying and selling, brokering, valuations of practices, helping out with location stuff. How can they reach out to you?
Yeah, I think the best place to find us is on our website, which is progressivepracticesales.com. We've got a ton of great content on there, and links to other collaborations that we've done with like NCMIC. And so lots and lots of information for someone who's interested in digging in.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you again for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. And if you want to make the shift from busy, broke, and broken to time-free and cash confident, or you just want to continue with the exponential growth, check us out at modernchiropracticmarketing.com. Look at the MCM Mastery tab, watch the short video on there, and check out what we are doing now for evidence-informed chiropractors. We are equal parts coaching and marketing done for you. Yes, you shoot some videos, we help you with campaign strategies and ideas and really become a thought leader in your community. You shoot those videos, you send them to us, we produce, edit, and brand them to you. Then we distribute them through all of your channels. We also take them and we turn it into one good blog per month. And every other month, we have Darcy Sullivan producing a robust blog with a topic that you pick from her database to help with your SEO. So we essentially become your content marketing agency to make sure your practice is always having ethical, elegant content marketing to help grow your practice. On the coaching side, we also help you with everything from marketing ideas to business, communications, finances, anything practice growth, and really try to help prevent you from being stuck on that island. And we hold you accountable. We have a great group of doctors that are just doing amazing things, and we look forward to help you out to take that next step in your practice. So again, check us out at modernchiropracticmarketing.com and learn more.